Okay, so this is chapter 13 video lecture, and this is our last chapter. Yay! So this chapter is focused on understanding prejudice and the behavior that leads to discrimination. And so we're going to talk about what the different components are of prejudice, and then we're going to talk about how we measure it. We're also going to talk about the way that it affects people that it's targeted toward, what aspects of our social lives can cause prejudice, and also what conditions can reduce prejudice. So that's our learning goals for this chapter, all right? So we are all victims or potential victims of prejudice for no other reason than our membership in an identifiable group. So it can be on the basis of ethnicity, nationality, skin color, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation, body size or disability, appearance, physical state, walking with a limp. That alone can be a basis of discrimination. Weight. Another appearance example, you might be discriminated against just because you look stereotypically Middle Eastern, and there was a lot of bias against Middle Eastern people that looked Middle Eastern in the United States after 9/11. So those are all different biases of discrimination, but it can be anything. You can be a victim of discrimination for no other reason than your membership in an identifiable group, right? So we know that prejudice is an attitude, right? And you guys will remember when we talked about attitudes early in the semester that every attitude has three components, right? A cognitive component, an affective component, and a behavioral component. What do I mean by that? What's a cognitive component? Well, a cognitive component is what? What are cognitions? Thoughts, right? So the cognitive component is the generalized beliefs or thoughts leading to stereotypes. And those are when identical characteristics are assigned to virtually all members of a group, regardless of actual variation within the group. Everyone gets labeled the same way. Everyone gets stereotyped the same way, okay? So that's that cognitive component of an attitude of prejudice. Okay, the affective component, this is the emotions that are associated with that prejudice. These are strong negative emotions leading to bias or hostility towards an individual or group on the basis of their group membership. Thirdly, that third component is behavioral component, and that's the actual discriminatory behavior or discrimination. This is the unjustified, harmful, differential behavior towards a person based solely on their group membership, right? So let's talk some more about this. Stereotypes, okay? So these are generalizations about a group of people, certain traits that are assigned to virtually all members of the group, regardless of actual variation among the members. And these stereotypes, these are cognitions. They were supposed to be helpful, or that's why we ever developed this this type of cognition, is because it helped us make sense of our social world by grouping people together. But what do we find? So stereotypes can be very harmful as well, right? Why? Although they're a cognitive process that can be positive or negative, and it's a technique that we use to simplify our world, meaning that we're cognitive misers. We take shortcuts and we adopt rules of thumb to better understand people, which helps us with our memory information processing, right? And helps us with our retention. So if we think about it, these are the little pictures that we carry around inside our heads, right? Think about these things and think about what comes to mind. High school cheerleader. There's a stereotype that comes to mind, right? How about a compassionate nurse? Another stereotype comes to mind. What about a Jewish computer scientist, right? How about a black musician? So think about those and tell me what comes to mind. Well, for the high school cheerleader, I don't think you thought about a guy, did you? I think you thought about a girl, right, in a short skirt, jumping up and down. That compassionate nurse, is that a guy? Probably not. How about the Jewish computer scientist? Definitely a guy, right? Not a woman. What about a black musician? Again, probably a man, not a woman, right? So we are all victim of stereotypes. How about this picture? What is this woman's occupation? Most Western non-Muslims hold the stereotype that Muslim women who wear the full-length hijab must be repressed, right? They must be repressed sexually as well as politically, right? But actually, this woman, Widad Luta, is a Muslim living in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. She's a marriage counselor and a sexual activist and the author of a best-selling Arabic sex manual, right? So stereotypes lots of times get us into trouble, right? Stereotypes are only adaptive when they accurately identify attributes of a group well, right? But they're maladaptive often because they blind us to individual differences, right? So you may be asking yourself, what's wrong with positive stereotypes? Like, what's the big deal with some stereotypes if they're positive, right? For example, what about sports? The stereotype, what's wrong with the stereotype that African Americans are naturally good at basketball, right? So what's the problem with that? Is that it denies the individuality of person, right? So the stereotype of that all African Americans are great at basketball ignores the fact that plenty of African American kids don't even like basketball. And plenty of white kids love basketball, right? So if we meet a young African American man and we feel astonished that he can't play basketball, we are denying him his individuality, right? So that's the problem with stereotypes, is it doesn't serve us in terms of understanding individuality or individual differences of people. We can see this also in stereotypes of gender. We have these traditional stereotypes of men and women. For instance, women, we have these positive stereotypes about women, that all women are caring and they're all good cooks, right? And then we have all these negative stereotypes of women. The biggest and most obvious being that the stereotype that women are inferior to men, right? This is also known as sexism. For men, there's also traditional stereotypes that don't necessarily apply across all groups of men. We have a positive stereotype that men are independent leaders. Is that true of all men? Probably not. How about negative stereotype that men are all dominant and controlling? Again, that blinds us to individual differences among men, these stereotypes. So let's talk about the second component of the attitude of prejudice. Let's talk about the emotions associated with prejudice, okay? So we know that negative emotions about groups are often ingrained, which means they're just there and we have to figure out what to do about them. And with emotions, the problem is when you feel emotional about something, it makes rational or logical arguments against that seem worthless or they're not effective against it, right? So this makes negative attitudes difficult to dispel. Things like prejudice, it makes it hard to dispel those because of this affective, emotional component, right? And here's a disturbing picture for you. So this is a picture of prejudice being actively taught, and this is often an implicit attitude that we acquire in our culture. Now, in this picture, it looks pretty much like it's an explicit attitude because this man is not ashamed of the fact that he's in the KKK, and he's quite aware of his explicit attitude towards people of color. So if we talk about the activation of prejudice, right? If it's an explicit attitude that is known to everyone, known to ourselves and known to others, prejudice is an attitude that we know that we have. For example, that gentleman who was wearing the KKK hat in the previous picture, I don't like brown people, or I don't like African American people, he might say. But if he has implicit prejudice, so he's not really consciously aware of it, if it's lurking just beneath the surface of his consciousness, then he's not going to be aware of it, and he's not necessarily going to say that, right? If he is not aware that he has this implicit bias against people of color, then he might not ever say or think, I don't like African Americans, or I don't like people of color, right? So let's talk a little bit more about what happens when prejudice is activated. So when we have this activation of our prejudices, once we learn it, and we have it, it's affectively based, it's emotionally present, and cognitively present. Then the behavior it leads to is called discrimination. Okay, and this is behaving more aggressively towards stereotype targets when we are stressed, when we're angry, when we're suffering a blow to our self-esteem, when we're not in control of our conscious intentions. This behavioral component will show up. Okay, let's review again what that means. We'll have discriminatory behavior. This discrimination, again, unjustified negative or harmful action against members of a group simply because of their membership in the group. So again, the activation of our prejudice leads to this discriminatory behavior. Okay? Where do we see this in the workplace? Let's talk about that. So we might see institutionalized discrimination against certain groups. We see this in discrimination in hiring. When overweight people are not hired or not promoted as often as non-overweight people. We see this often with gender. We know that men are paid more than women for the same work. Discrimination in policing, right? We see this a lot. We know about this a lot. Just in the last decade in the United States, this has been a huge issue. Blacks and whites are not treated equally. We see this in police brutality and police shootings. These disproportionately affect more brown Americans than white Americans, right? Other types of discrimination. Let's talk about other types. So again, let's define institutional discrimination. These are institutional practices that legally or illegally discriminate against a group because of its ethnicity, gender, culture, age, sexual orientation, etc., etc. An example, maybe a job description that requires gender as a requirement for a job. For instance, it used to be that in order to be a combat soldier in the armed forces, you had to be male. I think that's changed now. But at one time, or for all of American history until recently, you had to be a man to be in combat during war. How about everyday discrimination that we see, that we can term microaggressions? These are very small slights or indignities or put-downs, right? And this can be, again, against any group that the person has discriminatory attitudes towards. Here's an example. Maybe a white professor compliments his Asian student for his excellent English, right? So think about experiences of discrimination that you've experienced. Think about experiences of discrimination that you've had or that you've seen occur. Discrimination based on your skin color or your gender or your sexual orientation or your age or your religious affiliation or your membership in any group, right? So America's psychologists want you to understand racism and all the other isms out there, right? Sexism, ableism, ageism, heterosexism. There's a lot of isms out there, and these are all different types of discriminations, right? Another type of everyday discrimination that you may have experienced or that you've seen or that you've witnessed is something we call social distance. And this is a person's reluctance to get too close to a member of another group that they're prejudiced against, right? So they might be unwilling to work with the person in the other group, marry them, or live next door to members of a particular group. An example, maybe a stray student in one of your classes did not want to sit next to a gay student, right? So let's talk about, how do we measure prejudice? Are people truthful about their prejudice? So what is implicit bias? Tell me what implicit bias is. So these are those beliefs and attitudes that involve a lack of awareness and are unintentionally activated, right? This is what we mentioned earlier when we were talking about discrimination in hiring. There's these implicit biases there, sexism and racism. What's the difference between an implicit bias and an explicit bias? Well, as we mentioned, an explicit bias is those beliefs and attitudes of which people are aware and can control in their expression, right? So they're conscious and they're deliberate, right? So as we mentioned, there's all these different isms out there, okay? Ageism, sexism, racism, classism, anti-Semitism, heterosexism, right? So measuring all these isms can be very difficult, especially if they're implicit, so people are not aware that they have these attitudes, right? So there's ways that we have tried to measure these biases, these implicit biases, okay? So one example of some research that's been done showing these implicit biases was a research that where participants played video games, and we measured, the researchers, actually I was not involved, this would have been cool to be involved with, but the researchers measured the number of errors made in shooting people in the video game, right? And they broke this down according to race, and their findings clearly showed the implicit bias that people have. So let's look at that research. So here you go. Here's a chart showing the results of this research. And you'll see on the vertical axes the number of errors per 20 trials. And then across the horizontal axis, you see the race of the person that you were shooting at in the video. In the race, when the race of the person was white, the first two sets of bars, the number of errors were not as high as in the second set of bars when the race of the person was black. You can see that clearly, and I forgot to mention, the blue bars is referring to when the person was unarmed that you were shooting towards in the video game. The red bars are when the person was armed, okay? So what you'll see here is that when it was an unarmed black man, or black person, I think they were all men actually in the pictures, yes. When they were unarmed African Americans, those where the greatest number of errors were made in shooting people. And that's showing that implicit bias there. So the participants, again, were given the instructions. They were supposed to shoot a man if he was holding a gun and withhold fire if he was holding a harmless object, such as a cell phone. But as this graph shows, the player's most common error was to shoot the unarmed black man, right? So let's talk about suppressing prejudice. People will suppress prejudices for two reasons. One is they have a sincere motivation to become less prejudiced, right? So they're really trying not to be prejudiced, or they just don't want to be labeled, right? So that second reason then would be to avoid being labeled as sexist or racist, etc., right? So they just don't want to be politically incorrect. So you see this everywhere now. because it's now uncool to be prejudiced, period. It's believed to be unfair and unjust. We know it is, right? Unfair and unjust to be prejudiced against anyone based on the basis of their gender identity or their skin color or their sexual orientation. It's just, luckily in today's world, people have begun to recognize the nature of discrimination and all the isms that are out there. So long and short, what I'm trying to say is a lot of people are very successful at suppressing these biases they have. And oftentimes, they convince themselves, or they are become aware that they don't, or they become unaware that they still retain these biases. So these biases become implicit, right, as opposed to explicit. Okay, so how do we measure these biases once they're implicit, right? Well, there are ways that we have found. There's been some really cool ways that people have come up with to identify these implicit prejudices. So there's something called the implicit attitude test. Implicit association test. It's known more by its acronyms, IAT. And this is a really good way to identify implicit prejudice that is there. This measures these attitudes and beliefs about a particular group that people may have that they're unwilling or unable to report having, right? And how does it do this? Well, what it does is it measures the speed of your positive or negative reactions to target groups. And it's typically done with pictures in a video format. And the faster associations, or the more automatic associations, indicate implicit associations, okay? And there's a great video on this. So one caveat here about the IAT is that the IAT is measuring a preference, not necessarily a personally held belief, right? So what does that mean? It just means that they can't actually say that the test is saying that you have this this implicit bias. It's just showing that your preference, right? Your hidden preference is shown by how you respond to the IAT. There's an awesome video on the IAT, and it's actually, I've provided you with the website here. I really encourage you to go watch this. Alan Alda, who is, you may remember him, he was the actor that played the doctor in the 1970s show MASH. I don't know if you remember MASH. But anyway, it's only 7 minutes long, and it's a really great video done by a Scientific American. It's called The Hidden Prejudice, and it's all about implicit associations. So it's really good. I suggest that you go watch it. So let's move on to talking about the effects on the people that the prejudice is against, the effects of the prejudice on the victim. Okay, and let's talk about theories about why the prejudice occurs. Okay, so social scientists have really studied two primary effects of prejudice on victims. Okay, the self-fulfilling prophecy and social identity threat, or it's also known as stereotype threat. Okay, so let's talk about what these concepts are and how we as social psychologists have studied them. Okay, so self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's talk about what the heck is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, self-fulfilling prophecy is when we have an expectation of ourselves or of another's behavior that comes true because of the tendency for the way we think about ourselves, or the way that we treat another person because of the way we believe that they're going to act, right? So an example of how you might fulfill a self-fulfilling prophecy that you have of yourself, you say, "Oh man, women are not good at math." and that's why I can't do this calculus. Well, guess what? That's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. I internalized the stereotype that I couldn't do math. So then I believed it. So then I did not do well at it. I gave up too easily because it was challenging, it was hard, and I believed that I couldn't do it. Because I believed in the stereotype, I thought I had no control. I took away my own personal responsibility to learn the calculus. So I handicapped myself, okay, because I thought I was no good at it. I didn't try. I made it harder for myself, right? So there's also research that's been done looking at the self-fulfilling prophecy, where there was this communication, this nonverbal communication to candidates that they were not going to do well in the interview, and the candidates picked up on the nonverbal cues and didn't do as well because they were responding to the expectations put out there by the interviewers. So this was in phase 1 of this experiment. The white college students interviewed white and African American job candidates. When they interviewed the African American candidates, they displayed discomfort and lack of interest, but not when they interviewed the white candidates. Okay, so what happened? So what they did then in the second phase of the experiment, in the what they called the second experiment, they used Confederates for interviewers who acted like the white students had when they were interviewing the African American candidates in the first experiment, okay? And they measured how this affected the white interviewees in the second experiment. All the white interviewees were rated as more nervous and less effective. So the white interviewees were confirming the low expectations that they were picking up from the nonverbal behaviors they were getting from the interviewers, right? So the interviewer's behavior communicated the interviewer's expectations, which were that the interviewee would not do well in the interview, okay? Okay, so here's a fun little picture just to kind of help you think through this. So in the first study, we'll see the interviewer sits closer and has a longer interview with the white applicants, judges them to be effective and competent, but he sits further away and has shorter interview with the African American candidate and judges the applicant as more nervous, ineffective, and less competent, right? So that was in study 1. In study 2, then the Confederate displayed the same behavior that the previous interviewer had shown in the applicant with African American candidate. He did it with a white applicant. He sat further away. He had a shorter interview, and again, the applicant was judged as nervous, ineffective, and less competent than the applicant that he sat closer to and had a longer interview with. So when the white interviewers were trained to use one of the two interviewing styles from study 1, the white applicants were judged as performing more poorly when they received the style previously used for blacks or African Americans than when they received the style previously used for the white candidates, right? So let's talk a little bit about what we call social identity threat or stereotype threat. Okay, so in terms of the effects of prejudice on the victim, it's easy to assume that everybody from one group feels, acts, or believes the same things. And if you're a part of the group, it's easy to feel the threat of that, okay? So the threat that you feel as part of a group, or that I feel as a part of a group, is I feel that I'm going to be evaluated as a member of that group rather than as an individual, okay? And that evaluation of me is going to be based on a negative stereotype that the person evaluating me has of my group, okay? So the pressure on me then is to not conform to that negative stereotype. that the person has about my group, that the person who's evaluating me has about my group. So I'm going to feel anxious and I'm going to not do as well. It's going to reduce my ability or my performance because I'm going to feel that threat, that social identity threat or that stereotype threat. Okay? So what's happening in this picture? Okay? So there's something called social identity threat salience. Okay? So whether or not you feel stereotype threat depends on what category you're identifying with at the time of the or the situation that you're in. Okay, so in this picture we see people taking a test. Specifically, we're focused on the woman in the black shirt who is Asian, right? And she's taking what we know from the caption that this is a math test, right? So she might feel social identity threat if she is identifying as a woman while taking this test, because the stereotype is that women don't do well in math, right? So if that's the social identity that she is identifying with as she's taking this math test, she may not do as well on the test because of this social identity threat or stereotype threat, because that social identity is salient for her while she's taking the test. If instead her social identity as Asian is salient for her while she's taking the test, because the stereotype is that Asians do well at math, then she might do better on the test, right? If that's the social identity that's salient for her while she's taking the test, okay? So the social identity that's salient in the particular situation will affect the performance, okay? So how can we reverse the effects of stereotype threat, okay? How can we not let this affect us? Okay, well, first of all, knowledge is power. So if we're aware of it, right, that's going to help a lot. We can focus on having an alternative mindset and think about, hey, I'm a good student and I know this stuff, right? And we can practice self-affirmation. We can practice reminding ourselves of our good qualities, right? Okay, so you can reverse the effects of stereotype threat, okay? So now that we've talked about effects on victims of prejudice, let's turn to theories about why prejudice occurs. So why does prejudice occur? Well, there's a number of different theories about why prejudice occurs, and we're gonna talk about three of them. Okay, so one of them is the whole notion of that there are pressures to conform to prejudice. Okay, and the second is social identity theory. And the third is realistic conflict theory. So we're going to talk about each of those in turn, okay? So pressures to conform, this is inherited prejudices that people get from their parents or from other authority figures in their lives. These are normative rules that we learn, these institutionalized rules that lead to normative conformity. What is normative conformity? Well, that's when we conform because we want to be accepted and we want to follow the norms. So normative conformity is when we are prejudiced because that's the norm, and so we're just going along with the norms. The justification suppression model, we're going to talk about what that is in just a minute. And how that identifies or how that relates to the pressures to conform, okay? Social identity, we're going to talk about that more, belonging to a group and what the social identity theory then leads us to do in terms of prejudice. And then thirdly, realistic conflict theory, that's the whole notion of fighting over limited perceived resources, and we'll talk about that more in detail as well. Okay, so as I started to mention in terms of theory about prejudice and why it occurs, If we think about pressures to conform, there's different ways that we become prejudiced as part of our pressures to conform. We learn it from our parents, or maybe we were a member of a group where the prejudice against certain groups is part of what's required to be a member of our group. So we do that. We exhibit that prejudice because we are conforming normatively. So that normative conformity is happening. Remember, this normative conformity is something that we do. We as human beings have this strong tendency to go along with the group in order to fulfill the group's expectations and gain acceptance of the group by the group, right? That's that normative conformity. Okay. So what does that mean in terms of the justification suppression model? Well, this model, the JSM, was put out by Crandall and Eichelman in 2003, and they talked about there's a struggle between the urge to express prejudice and the need to maintain positive self-esteem. Okay, so let's talk about an example of this. Okay, so what if I'm a guy and I really don't think that women should be in the workplace because the workplace is very competitive and can be very cutthroat, and just women are just not cut out for that. It's just not appropriate for women, right? So this justification suppression model will say that I have to suppress this prejudice against women in the workplace in order to maintain my positive self-concept, because I'm a part of this normative culture that says, in order to be a nice guy, I should be okay with women being in the workplace, right? So I suppress then this belief that I have that women shouldn't be in the workplace, and this struggle requires energy. This takes a lot for me to suppress these prejudiced impulses that I have. So in order to justify my feelings of entitlement and superiority over women in the workplace, I have to seek ways or reasons for holding my negative attitudes toward women in the workplace. Okay, so I might say, gosh, it's really a bummer that Marlene lost that account to Marvin. And I know that there were a lot of issues that came into play, but the problem is she's just too nice, right? I can't give her another shot at being an account rep because she's just too nice. It's just not going to work out, right? So what am I doing? What am I doing here? I am, in order to conserve my energy and to seek I'm seeking a valid justification for why I'm holding this negative attitude about a woman's success in the workplace. I'm holding this negative attitude toward this particular outgroup, women, and then I can act out against that outgroup, right? I'm not going to give her another chance to be an account rep, but I'm not going to feel like I am sexist, right? So then I'm able to avoid cognitive dissonance, right? But I think it's important to point out here that when we're external to situations, we don't have to let situations go unchallenged, right? When we can see prejudice occurring. So here's an example of when people stepped in when they saw prejudice occurring and they challenged it. So this is a story about confronting anti-gay bias that happened in South Carolina. So when the mayor of Latta, South Carolina, fired this woman who was a 20-year force veteran, Crystal Moore, from her position as a police chief in 2000, as the police chief in 2014. He made little secret of the fact that it was because she was gay. So people figured that out pretty quickly. But the citizens of Latta were outraged and rallied behind her and forced a vote on a referendum that allowed the town council to reinstate her. So by reacting vocally to examples of prejudice in our environments, we have the potential to create norms that can combat these biases, right? So there is a way to combat them, okay? So let's talk about the next type of theory about prejudice, the social identity theory. So we have pressures to conform, but that's not all. We also have our membership in our groups, and this membership in our groups is part of our social identity theory, okay? This theory says that when you're a member of a group, you take on an us versus them mentality, and you believe that your own group or culture or nation or religion is superior to all others. So an example of this would be ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is when you go to Europe and you feel superior as an American, and you say, yeah, I'm an American and our ways of doing things are better. So that's being ethnocentric. Okay, so this is social identity theory is this approach to understanding prejudice, okay? So in this theory, we have what's called in-group bias, and this is the tendency to favor members of one's own group and give them special preferences over people who belong to other groups. And it doesn't matter what type of group it is. The group can be temporary and trivial or significant, but we're still going to have an in-group bias if we're a member of the group, okay? The major underlying motive of this is self-esteem, okay? So we enhance our self-esteem by identifying with specific groups. And I'll feel better about myself if I see my group as better than other groups, okay? So this is different or opposite of another thing we do. Another thing we do is we see other groups as very homogeneous. So we have what's called outgroup homogeneity. So we perceive outgroup members as being more similar, homogeneous than they really are. So if you know one Republican, you know something about them all because they are perceived as all alike, right? So it makes it easier to stereotype outgroups, right? Okay. So as this theory says, when times are tough and resources are scarce, the in-group members will feel more threatened by the out-group members, okay? And incidences of prejudice, discrimination, and violence towards out-group members will increase, okay? So we've seen this in our own country where when times are tough and resources get scarce, we say, oh, all the Mexicans coming in are taking all of our jobs, right? So there's a greater number of incidences of prejudice, discrimination, and violence towards Mexicans as an outgroup when resources get scarce along the border, okay? So what else happens according to this theory? Well, we will also do something called blaming the victim, okay? When empathy is absent, it can be hard to avoid blaming the victim. And if they're outgroup members, then we're not going to have much empathy for them, okay? For example, rape victims. So an example of blaming the victim, oh, she must have deserved it. She was behaving inappropriately. She was dressed provocatively, right? So blaming the victim serves as a self-protective function. If you say the reason this happened to them is because of something they themselves did, then it can't happen to me because I wouldn't behave that way, right? Another phenomenon is scapegoating, okay? So people will tend to displace aggression onto groups that are disliked or visible or relatively powerless. These outgroups, and the type of aggression against these outgroups is going to be dependent on what the in-group approves or allows. But for example, post 9/11 anti-Muslim prejudice, you saw this a lot, and this was scapegoating Muslims because of the whole theory that this was all, that Muslims as general were all evil and bad, right? So this was scapegoating Muslims. Okay, so enough about social identity theory. Let's tackle the third theory that we see as we offer, or that social psychology offers as an explanation for prejudice. And that third theory is realistic conflict theory. So realistic conflict theory says that there's limited resources and that fighting over these resources or there's conflict that occurs because of these limitation of these resources, and that this also leads to prejudice and discrimination as well. Okay? So reducing prejudice, there's some suggested ways that have been shown to be fairly effective. One is called the contact hypothesis. And then we're also going to talk about cooperation and interdependence, which were sort of further developments beyond the contact hypothesis. So the contact hypothesis originally hypothesized that mere contact between groups was not sufficient to reduce prejudice, okay? That the contact hypothesis can actually create opportunities for conflict, and that the prejudice will decrease when there are two conditions met. Both groups are of equal status, and that both two groups share a common goal, right? So research obviously has studied this to see if we could find support for the contact hypothesis. So this figure shows research that was done in a longitudinal study of black students at a predominantly white university. So initially, many black students at this university felt dissatisfied and excluded from student life. But the more white friends they made, their higher their sense of belonging, which is the blue bar, and satisfaction with the university, which is the red bar, improved. This finding was particularly sensitive for the minority students who had been the most sensitive to rejection and who had felt the most anxious and insecure about being in a largely white school. And they were able to replicate the study as well with Latino students as well. So this is based on research by Mendoza Denton and Paige Gould in 2008. So looking at the impact of cross-ethnic friendships, okay? Additional research that we can discuss in relation to the contact theory. Sharif and colleagues way back in 1961 found that once the hostility and the distrust were established between groups, simply removing conflict and removing competition did not restore harmony. In fact, just bringing the two groups together in a neutral situation would just increase their hostility and distrust of one another. But what did they find? Well, they found that when there was an interdependence there, then the contact would reduce the prejudice. So that is, when there was a need for the groups to depend on one another to accomplish a goal that was important to both groups, then that would reduce the prejudice. So more specifically, there were 4 conditions that they found to be helpful to reduce prejudice between the groups. If they had a mutual interdependence, they had a common goal, they had equal status, and they were supported by social norms, then the intergroup relations would improve. And let's look at a graph of that. Okay, so This is looking specifically at two groups of kids, the Eagles and the Rattlers. These were kids in a camp, and the Eagles and the Rattlers were in competition. So, and few of the boys in each one of these groups had friends from the other side, okay? So the intergroup tensions between the groups were eased only after the boys had to cooperate to get shared privileges, and then the boys began to make friends across enemy lines. So you'll see the first two bars, this was before cooperative activities were introduced. Almost none of them had, or a very small percentage of them had best friends in the outgroup. But then after the cooperative activities were introduced, a bunch more of them had friends who had best friends in the outgroups, right? So again, this is where cooperation fostered the intergroup relations, okay? How about classrooms? Well, we see a lot, been a lot of concern over the years trying to figure out how to make desegregated classrooms more effective, okay? Well, the problem is in a typical desegregated classroom, the students are not of equal status and they're not pursuing common goals. Traditional classrooms are very competitive, right? Okay, and children bring different levels of status to the classroom. They wear different clothes, they bring in different lunches. There's definitely a status and a pecking order in a classroom, okay? But researchers have created something called the jigsaw classroom. Well, in the jigsaw classroom, they saw a great increase in cooperation and interdependence, and they did things much differently. The children were placed in small desegregated groups, and each child was dependent on other children in his group to learn the course material and do well. And an example of this would be like a Montessori classroom. Part of the way that the children learn the material is by explaining it to other children, right? So it raises the self-esteem of the kids when they get to teach other kids, and it reduces the prejudice and promotes integration within the classrooms. So it's been a very big success story. It's called a classroom that works for all, okay? And again, why does the jigsaw classroom work? Well, it breaks down the perception of the in-group and the out-group, and it creates feelings of oneness, right? People have to do each other favors by sharing information, and they also develop empathy for one another, right? Because they have the shared experience of trying to teach other people, and they understand, that it's tricky, okay? One of the most effective ways to improve race relations is by improving empathy and improving instruction, and this has been shown in the jigsaw classroom. Okay, so that's the end of this chapter looking at prejudice.